A video went viral recently on Twitter/X in which a man from the United States visited China this year for the first time
but
since
there are
2019.
dozens of other Chinese brands that you have never heard of that are selling cars as cheap as $10,000. Not like shit cars, you know, not like a tricycle, but like a full-blown sedan for $10,000. And they're everywhere. It's different now. People are civilized. I'm in China. I feel like I'm in Japan now.
Molson Hart joins us at Shanghai Daily to discuss his observations about China and the response he's received since posting the video. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you. I'm happy to be here.
All right, wonderful. Yeah, so you mentioned in the video that you've been coming to China for 10 years. What parts of the country have you visited and how have your experiences been?
Sure. I think the first time I went to China was in 2011, and I didn't speak Chinese at all. I was trying to start a business at that time, and that business was a manufacturing business. And I asked the richest person I knew, hey, I'm struggling to get this product made in China. What do I do? And he basically said, the Chinese like face to face. Next thing you know, I was in Liaoning province, didn't speak any Chinese, and it was quite a shock. Frankly, it was quite difficult because at that time there were no other foreigners. There wasn't the kind of same support system that you might find in some of the bigger cities for people who don't speak Chinese or know really anything about the country.
Right, sure. So just generally speaking, when you talk about your experiences in China to people back home, how do they sort of contrast with some of the perceptions that people have of the country, and how do people react to the things you say and stories you might tell?
That's a really complex question. It's possible this whole interview will be complex, but I would say it varies a lot by the time period. So I would say the perceptions of China have changed when I first went to China in 2011 versus 2024. In 2011, I would say the general perception was that China was a poor, developing country. I seem to have lost you here,
I got you.
but it's still recording, so I'll keep going. Yep. Oh, okay, great. It was a poor developing country, whereas today, maybe the perception in the United States is that it's more of a rising economic power. But I think the last most powerful memory in Americans' minds when it comes to China is just the lockdowns. Like the pandemic and COVID had a very profound effect on the perception of China in the United States.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah. So talking about your video specifically, your video about the 7 major ways that you observe that China has changed since you were last here. And you were last here 5 years ago in 2019. Is that right?
Yeah, that's right. I went to Canton Fair in, I think, October 2019, right before, it became difficult to travel back and forth.
Of course, the Canton Fair is a large expo for international goods that takes place in the city of Guangzhou, right? So tell me about some of the responses and replies that you've gotten. I watched your video. I thought it was really interesting. And I saw that there were various responses on Twitter itself. Can you talk about some of the sort of responses and replies? I know they're a bit varied. Sort of how would you evaluate the response to the video?
I was happy and also a little bit disturbed by how many people ended up ultimately seeing the video. I think I don't know, all in probably like 3 to 4 million views. It ranged from surprise to disbelief. Not everyone believed what I was saying was true. Some people were kind of generalizing and saying that I hadn't left Shanghai when in reality I went, to some rural areas. I wasn't in like Ningxia or something like that. I speak atonal Chinese, by the way. It's kind of bad. But I went to Yiwu in Zhejiang, which is its own kind of thing on this trip. And so there were responses all over the map. I would say in general, there isn't like a very good information flow between China and the United States, as far as I can tell, in really either direction. So it's So you get like responses all over the map, and it almost depends on what people's viewpoints are going into the video. I mean, everyone in every country has preconceptions about the way other countries are. And so I would say it's like highly dependent on that.
Yeah, I think that's definitely true. I mean, in my personal experiences are somewhat similar to that. As a follow-up question to that, is this the first time you've ever had a video on social media, Twitter or otherwise, go viral to that extent?
It's the first time I've ever had a video go viral. I've had like images and text go viral, and it's a very unique experience. Depending on what your content is, you can get some really crazy responses. Yeah,
for sure. Yeah, definitely. So I think in the video, in my opinion, at least, you were quite straightforward and factual about several aspects of what it's like in China in 2024. Do you find that a lot of people that you talk to, either online or in person, are interested in the topic and open to understanding China better, or are they more entrenched in their beliefs about the country, even if they've never visited?
I think it's a mix, and I think that's true in every country. I mean, there's some people who will just believe whatever they see, and then there are other people who are more open-minded. For whatever reason, I think like most people watched that video and for some reason got the sense that I was sincere, which I was. And, I also took, there's some things that are quite easily provable, right? So if I say that one of the things that I mentioned was that there's been a huge increase in the number of electric vehicles in China. To people in China, that is no surprise. To people in the United States and the general improvement in the quality of the air, that's a pretty big surprise. But, like if you take a video of the cars on the streets in Shanghai or outside of Shanghai, it doesn't have to be in one of China's most developed cities. It's quite obviously provable that there are lots of electric vehicles on the streets. And so, I guess like people at one point in time, I think someone said like, this guy does not appear to be a shill. I hope I'm not a shill. And they seemed a little bit convinced that their perception of China, which I would say these days is very lockdown dominant, as I was saying earlier, needed to be changed somewhat. The country's been changing for as long as I've been going to China, and it didn't stay static between 2019 and 2024. There's been a lot of progress, and a lot of it's been positive. So I just try to tell it like it is, and if I can improve cooperation between the United States, I'm an American citizen, and China, and like increase the dialogue by doing things like this, I'm gonna do it because I think it's productive for both sides. We need to live with each other. So let's talk.
That is a fact. That's a fact. Yeah. So as you mentioned, one of the things that you mentioned in the video is the digital payments. I think this is something that I like to talk about when I'm speaking with people from the US and elsewhere. We use it for essentially everything in China, as you know, and I think sometimes it's hard for people back home to truly grasp the degree to which it's totally ubiquitous. How do you feel about the payment system that we use here as compared to the US or maybe in other countries?
Like just objective. So we have Apple Pay in the United States, which is more or less the same thing as 支付宝. Again, I speak atonal Chinese.
You got it.
It's everywhere in China, and you can do everything with it. And it's really, really nice and convenient. It's just nice to be able to do everything. And when I was traveling years ago in China, particularly as a foreigner, it was like really, really difficult to get things done. And it was also like difficult, to get in a taxi, to communicate where to go, to negotiate the payment. And I raised this in the video. This no longer seems to be the case, but all the time I used to have difficulties with like taxis, like not wanting to turn on their meter when I got in them, not wanting to go to certain locations. And just like the combination of electronic payments, using the phone and like, Didi Dacha and all that stuff, that like really made my experience better. And so there's a little bit of a learning curve for people who are not originally from China, but I would definitely encourage Americans to visit China, and I would definitely encourage Chinese people to visit the United States. I see it as a win-win for both of the countries, and I also think it'll benefit anyone who's able to do that.
Definitely, yeah. So like I said, I also came to China several years ago, maybe when the learning curve was a little bit steeper. Do you feel like perhaps the learning curve is kind of flattened out? Obviously, the language barrier is daunting for those who are sort of newbies with the Chinese language. It's harder, famously difficult. But do you think that learning curve that you and I both have dealt with has maybe flattened out for somebody that might try to come to China, be it as a tourist or be it as somebody to study or starting a life or a business or something like that?
Yeah, it definitely has. I mean, it used to be a nightmare to like purchase train tickets and stuff like that as a foreigner. And like, most Chinese names are like 3, maybe 4 characters. My name is like,
Right.
like 40 characters or whatever. Those issues seem to have been mostly resolved. And I could take my passport, I scanned it, and I just was able to get on a high-speed train. Still think there's a learning curve. I mean, some of the apps I was using, it was pretty helpful for me be able to recognize Chinese characters, but it's definitely gotten significantly easier to visit China post the lockdowns and quarantines in particular. That was a period where it was obviously a little bit more difficult.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So can you tell me a little bit more? You also mentioned sort of the robotics, automation, and things like that. Can you tell me a little bit more about the automation and robotics you've seen in factories in China?
Yeah, sure. So as I said in the video, which went viral, in the United States, we generally have the perception of China as a country which is able to achieve cheap pricing in goods by throwing lots of cheap people at problems. But the reality is that when you visit factories in China, there's a great deal of automation. I mean, it's not everywhere, it's not everything, it's not robots all over the place, but I see it a lot when I visit factories which make plastic products. It may sound simple, but like robotic arms that are grabbing plastic parts, pulling them out, placing them on conveyor belts going to other parts of the factory so the goods can be processed and packaged and stuff like that. And I mean, there's just a great deal of automation, which is important because if you can set it up right, it both increases quality and reduces cost. So, compliments to Chinese businesses for getting that done.
Have you noticed that that's a change that you've seen specifically since 2019, or is that something that had been, the wheels of that were in motion prior, for example, compared to when you first came to China for the first time?
I think all change is gradual. And what I'm experiencing is like, so whether it's automation or Zhifubao becoming more ubiquitous, there are all sorts of different changes, the air becoming better. It's like, it's like this, all right? Or like maybe it's like this, right? But I'm here in 2019 and then I'm there in 2024, right? So it's like 5 years. So it seems to me like there's kind of like a big jump, you know what I mean? But in reality, probably over time, like it's not like all the factories in China snap their fingers and we're like, we're all going to automate now. It's just like you add a robot or automation, one machine or factory at a time. But if you don't visit a country for a long period of time, then it seems like it was a major improvement versus last time you were there.
Yeah, it's interesting for me to get your perspective because I've been here in China for the most part the entire time for the last nearly 15 years. And so for me, obviously, when I compare it to what it was like when I first came, I can see the change. But it's interesting to talk to you about it because of that jump that you mentioned. Of course, you mentioned Zhifubao, which is Alipay, which is essentially the Chinese equivalent of Apple Pay. Would you characterize it that way?
Yeah, or arguably Apple Pay is the American equivalent of Zhifubao.
Right. Sure. Yes, of course. So in your industry or in others, as you've noticed, how has manufacturing and the supply chain itself kind of changed in China? I know you mentioned this in the video.
Sure. Yeah, there's a disintermediation. So in other words, like middlemen have been cut out. So you go to factories in China, and many factories are operating stores on Pinduoduo, they're operating stores on Tianmao, Tmall, Taobao, and stuff like that. And so that's one of the changes. I mean, you'll see like a close relationship, sometimes through middlemen, sometimes without, between factories and basically influencers who are doing video. I don't know what it's called, like live sales and like videos on Douyin and stuff like that. I mean, this is probably not news to the Chinese people in China who are watching this, but to people in the United States, this is pretty mind blowing because, a lot of these things we're not doing in the United States. And so it's been interesting if you look today versus 5 years ago to see how, let's call it like e-commerce, or let's call it manufacturing and stuff like that, has changed, and how like middlemen have been removed or been inserted through, like, before we didn't really have as many video influencers 5 years ago. So it's just been interesting to see the change.
Yeah, I do agree. The trends are interesting. I have noticed that I'll call it live stream sales or something like that has sort of picked up even in the US a little bit, kind of following the trend of China, which I find to be interesting. I want to ask you another question. Oh, go ahead. Sorry.
Yeah, that's absolutely true. Like, we opened a shop on TikTok, which is America's like Douyin, and the sales are coming in, but we're developing it, and we've seen others be very successful doing that.
So I hear a lot of pundits in the US and in other countries often talk about the impending collapse of China or something to this effect. Have you heard this, and sort of what's your reaction to that as somebody who's been to China and spends some time here?
It depends on what they mean or what they think they mean. I mean, I'm not even like sure how to answer that question. Look, I think it just comes down to what I was saying earlier. Like, Americans need to visit China, Chinese need to visit the United States, and while there's a language barrier, while there's an existing cultural barrier, I think that improves understanding, like, on both sides, and that's, and then you reduce things like narratives like, country X is in collapse or country Y is rising. These things are like, a great deal more complicated than that. And so, I mean, that's what I would just recommend for everyone who's saying that China is collapsing, or vice versa. Like, just visit the country, because I think by and large, people who write or say those things don't.
True. And then on a more lighthearted note, what are some of your favorite places to go or things to do and enjoy when you're here in China?
The first thing that comes to my mind is Yiwu. Yiwu in Zhejiang province. That place is just like wild. It's just like a crazy world. So, one of the things that Americans take a great deal of pride in is like the idea that like anyone can become American. And one thing that I saw in Yiwu that was like pretty cool is I saw this like African guy who was driving a Range Rover, and I speak French, and I kind of like asked him, I was like, hey, how did you, there's a famous like video type in the United States where someone on TikTok, on Douyin, they like go up to a person who's like driving a Ferrari and kind of is just like, hey, like, how'd you make the money to like buy this Ferrari? And then someone tells their life story. And so I went up to this African guy who was driving his nice brand new Range Rover, and I was like, hey man, in French, how did you make the money to buy this Range Rover in China? And he didn't give much of a story, but he said that, he does business in China. And I thought that was cool. Shanghai is an amazing city. Just an amazing city. Highly recommend everyone visit. So that's another cool place. I don't know. There's so many cool places to go in China. Like, get on the high-speed rail. It's very convenient. I mean, I just really went to Zhejiang and Shanghai. I didn't really go many other places this trip. But I don't think there's really anywhere in China where I was like, oh, I don't want to go there. That place is bad. I mean, I feel like I either always learn something, or it's good for business, or the food's good, it's entertaining. I mean, it's an experience. So go anywhere you can.
Yeah, I totally agree. I mean, China is a big and diverse country, and it's a place that I also like to travel around. Well, thanks, Molson, very much. I appreciate your insight on the video, and best of luck to you. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Alex. It was a pleasure.
All right, likewise.